Hi, Ariana.
Anna and Laura and Jen, Lenny.
Hi. Hi, Ariana.
Hello to everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, it's 5 o'clock, so we can start our event. My name is Ariana Dagnino, and I am the Cultural Events Coordinator of the Dante Alighieri Society of BC. On behalf of the Dante Society, I welcome you to tonight's event, a talk by Dr. Arthur Molella, live from Washington, DC. But before I introduce our speaker tonight, I would like to invite the General Consul of Italy, Mr. Fabio Messineo, to say a few words. I just stopped sharing my presentation here. And thank you, Consul, to be with us tonight. I leave you the floor.
Good evening, everyone. And I would like to thank the Dante Alighieri Society of BC for organizing this interesting talk about Adriano Olivetti. Special thanks to Professor Arthur Molella from Washington. Adriano Olivetti gained fame globally for inventing the world's first portable typewriter and desktop computer, Programma 101. But I would like to underline briefly another significant aspect of this important entrepreneur. His ambitious experiment in how to build what he called a more human industrial city. His main goal was to enhance the human being also in the work environment. In the early 90s, I lived near Ivrea, where Olivetti based this company for 3 years. And the first time I visited Ivrea, I was impressed by the beauty of the center of production, very different from other existing factories, also as we were used to see them nowadays. He placed the company in an ideal city among gardens, fountains, big spaces, and the factories were designed on human scale. He equipped factories with the nurseries, daycares, prenatal clinics, vocational schools for teenagers, gyms, libraries, and they sent camping to the seaside in Tuscany the children of the employees at the company's expenses. Ivrea is very far from the coast. From being an alienating place, the factory turned into a place of personal growth and development. The productivity of Olivetti workers, 35,000 in that time, was 5 times higher than other workers in the same period. His legacy about harmony between private life and public life, between work and the home, between center of consumption and center of production is a very interesting topic, especially in these days where most of us are working from home. He was a real genius and pioneer that unfortunately passed away too early. I'm certain you will all enjoy the lecture. Thank you e arrivederci.
Thank you so much. And now let me just say a few words about our society. The Dante Alighieri Society of BC is a non-profit organization for the promotion of Italian language and culture. We organize Italian language courses through the Dante Alighieri Italian Language School, in Vancouver, from beginner to advanced level. And we also have short courses, for example, on Italian for tourists, in preparation also in view of, of the end of this COVID situation, when everyone will be able to again start traveling and visiting Italy for real and not just virtually. And really we encourage you also to become members of our society. The early membership costs only $30, or to make a donation, because this is how we support ourselves, and this is how we can still keep on producing, offering this kind of events. And now let me just introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Arthur Molella was the founding director, now emeritus, of the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation at the National Museum of American History. He received his PhD in the history of science from Cornell University. He teaches in Johns Hopkins University's Department of the History of Science and Technology and in its online Masters in Museum Studies program. He has curated exhibitions on such subjects as the Nobel Prize and the importance of play to invention. He is the author or co-author of numerous books and articles on the relationship between science, technology, and society. His books include Invented Edens, Techno-Cities of the 20th Century, World Fairs on the Eve of War, Places of Invention, and World's Fairs in the Cold War. He was recently awarded the 2020 Leonardo da Vinci Medal of the Society for the History of Technology. So join me in welcoming Dr. Arthur Molella to our virtual podium.
Thank you for that gracious introduction, and I want to thank the Italian Council for that wonderful introduction to Ivrea. He could have given my talk tonight. And I've been to Ivrea, and I can vouch for been there several times, for the beauty of the city and the transformation that's there, and you'll see some of that tonight. So I'll get into my talk at this point. I also want to thank the Dante Alighieri Society for inviting me. And I told Professor Dagnino that I wished that she had done this outside of COVID so that I could have come out there in person, because I love Vancouver. You're very lucky to be out there. So I guess you could be far flung. All of you could be someplace else in Canada at this point if we're online. Just a forewarning, I also mentioned this to Ariana that instead of saying Adriano Olivetti, I'm going to say Adriano Olivetti. I'm going to anglicize all the names like my own name. Okay, so just be warned that that's how I'll be presenting.
And sorry if I interrupt you, Arthur, just to let you know how we have structured the event. Perhaps Arthur will be talking half an hour, about half an hour. Then we'll have a small pause, a short pause for a first Q&A. And then Arthur will resume his talk for another 20 minutes or so, another half an hour. And then we will have a second Q&A. In this way, you will have, the opportunity to interact with our speaker in two different moments. Thank you, Arthur.
Sounds wonderful. Should I go ahead and put my share my screen at this point,
Sure.
Mariana? Okay.
Sure.
Let's hope I do this right, Mamma Mia.
Yes. And also remember to share sound, check the box.
I have share sound, and I have to go to my desktop now. Let me see. Here it is right here. Is that it?
Yes, it's there.
Can everybody see me? Do you hear me as well?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Well, there's my title. There's me. Ariana suggested I say a little bit about myself in this strange place called the Lemelson Center for the Invention and Innovation. So I'll do a little self-introduction at this point, if you will indulge me on this, because this will be a lead into my talk, because I pick up from that as well. I guess I have to use this to advance it. Okay. I was the founding director of the Lemelson Center at the Smithsonian for Invention and Innovation. And just to let you know, Jerome Lemelson was an inventor who did very well in patent litigation and invention, and made a whole lot of money in the United States. And he gave a bequest for this center. He died in 1997. And the center does a variety of things, which I'll mention in a second. But the overall sort of gestalt of the center is that we have an interest in the historical approach to invention and innovation. But we see history as going to the present and sometimes going into the future. You learn from the past to move to the future. And I'll list some of the well, this is where it's located. I don't know if any of you have been to Washington, but this is the mall, and that's the National Museum of American History. And as it happens, I'll be talking a lot about modernism tonight. This was the first modern building on the mall. Did somebody move that or did I move that? Let's see, hold on. This was the very first modern building on the mall, built in 1964. And you can see it's kind of a combination of classical, some mid-century modern with mid-century modern. You can see the sort of columns around it as well. So that's where it's situated. And it's a unit of the whole Smithsonian. This museum is a unit which has 19 some units, museums and research centers and so on. Let me just tell you a little bit about what we do at the Lemelson Center. We cover an awful lot of activities. We are one of the first centers ever like this, independently funded at the Smithsonian. We have exhibitions. We have something called the Spark Lab, which is for kids at Hands-On Center. We have public programs of all types. We have collaborations with many institutions, academic and otherwise. We run conferences of all kinds. We participate in them. We have a publication series, including a book series with MIT Press. We have a very vigorous fellowship program. So those of you who are interested in coming to Washington post-COVID, we'd love to have you to come. We keep a pretty extensive archives of invention there in that museum. We have strong educational programs. And we also conduct, for the archives, audio and video interviews. And I'll give you an example of one interview here. This is Stephanie Kwolek. She was the inventor of Kevlar. And we not only did an interview with her, we brought her into the museum. And she had a particular interest in getting girls interested in science and technology. And so we brought her in and she met with girls in middle school mostly on this and was very effective. She's now deceased, but well, she was wonderful. Now, I mentioned exhibitions, and this is the connection we have with Ivrea here. We did an exhibition in 2015 and I was involved I produced a book for this called Places of Invention. And this is all about the relationship between place and the kind of inventions that evolve from different places. There's different styles of inventions that come out of different places. People tend to think that invention is just sui generis and comes out of, can come out of nowhere. But they do come out of a place, and it matters a lot whether places are nurturing invention or not nurturing invention. So we explore in this exhibit several places, all in the US, that have become inventive hotspots like this. Silicon Valley being the iconic one that we all talk about. It's the one invention place that has lasted for many, many years. Most of them tend to die out in about 20 years. So here's Silicon Valley. This is a popular image of a poster for Silicon Valley, but it doesn't have inventive places go way back in time, and they can look different from Silicon Valley. They can look like this, for example, Leonardo's Italy. The Renaissance Italy was a very hot spot for invention of all kinds. And I talk about invention, I use the term very broadly, and there's an interrelationship between invention, innovation, and all kinds of creativity. It's artistic creativity, which is particularly germane for understanding Ivrea tonight. And this is what got me launched onto subjects like Ivrea. That was my personal work that I was doing on the outside. I love working in Italy, and I've done it for years. I have lots of relatives in Italy, but my Italian is extremely poor, except for reading. I read Italian very well, but my speaking knowledge ain't great. So that's the reason you see hearing this in English tonight. So today I want to talk about a little computer called Programma 101. Was mentioned by the council tonight. And this little machine had at first, quiet debut in New York City at a New York City trade fair in October 1965. And this, you can argue till the cows come home about who invented what at what time, who's got the priority. That's a hobby of historians of technology. Let's try to, see if we can find something before Gutenberg invented something. Well, this has a real strong claim to being the very first desktop computer, and therefore a route to the PC. And it's at least 20 years ahead of what Macintosh did in 1984. So it does have that claim. But the interesting thing about this, it sort of popped up at this trade fair and suddenly became a sensation at this fair, totally unexpectedly. But it faded out in just a few years. So there's an interesting story about its genesis and what happened to it. And that's the story I explored. It did come out of my work on World's Fairs, as a matter of fact. I had this book on World's Fairs in the Cold War. And that's what's interesting about this too, because I'm interested not only in the technological context broadly considered, but the ideological context. And there's a very strong Cold War story behind this, and also a story about utopias too. Of course, you could think of, present day utopias that they continue to exist. But this impulse is embodied in this computer. So that's what I will be talking about today. And naturally, I'll be talking about Ivrea, the hometown of the Olivettis and the birthplace of Programma 101. And I think of Ivrea really as was mentioned, as a classic place of invention, a classic hotbed of invention. In its heyday, it was probably one of the great company towns in the entire world. And that lasted for quite a while in Ivrea. And it's not surprising that it has produced some of the great inventions in office machines and very finely made machines, very beautiful machines. And I will maintain that this productivity, this environment that nurtured so much is due essentially to one man, Adriano Olivetti. Here he is here, and then typical pose among the people. He was a man of the people in many ways. He was a very charismatic guy. And he was, he really fits the model of a Renaissance man. His interests were so wide-ranging. And that was the power of what he did, because he brought these interests together. Everybody knows about the beauties of Italian design. Programma 101 is, you probably know this best, not through the technology, but through seeing this at, let's say, a modern art museum. The Museum of Modern Art had this exhibit. They have the Programma 101 in their collections. Several modern art museums in the world have it there for the design, but you probably don't know it for its role in the history of technology. And that's what got me fascinated with this machine. The big idea that Adriano Olivetti had was the idea of comunità, community. And he called it the concrete community. And he wrote prolifically on this subject. He came out with most of his books in the 1940s, but these are ideas that he'd been nurturing, gestating in him for a decade or more. And he finally started coming out with these ideas after he had been in exile in Switzerland during the Badoglio regime. He was the head of Italy after the fall of Mussolini and the fascist. And Adriano had left Italy during that period for a period of about 2 years. He came back in 1945, actually, and came back full of new ideas, or full of ideas that had sort of gelled there in Switzerland. And he wanted to put them to work as soon as he could when he got back. Well, the idea of comunità is very hard to describe to you, but it's very political and very ideological. And if I go into it too deeply, you're going to get into all the sort of nuances of politics of Italy at that time and of culture. But the basic thing with community is that he wanted to see Italy come out of the war, the destructiveness of the war, with a new paradigm, a paradigm of communities, where people would be closely bound to one another, but in small settings, in small community settings. The only thing about this is he's building this around a great big technological organization at the center of all of this. Olivetti was very big by this time as a firm, by the time he starts developing these ideas, and he was responsible for much of that. But it's, you could say small is beautiful. I mean, Ivrea is a small town, but he mostly, the best way to explain this is he wanted a humane technology, a humane community. He wanted an industrial policy that brought together workers, brought together citizens with managers and owners. This is very important to him. He thought this would be the key to coming out of the destructive years of fascism and the terrible destruction wrought on Italy during the war. He saw the basic problem for Italy. Well, two parts to it. One was industrialization, and the other one was urbanization. And rampant industrialization, urbanization had really caused a lot of destruction. So he was trying to tame this by this community idea. It took many books, which are tantamount to manifestos, to explain these. Now, Camillo was actually heavily inspired by his father, Adriano, by his father on the left, Camillo Olivetti. Now, he's very lucky to have inherited the business from his father, as a matter of fact, but he also inherited the ideology and the sort of compassion of his father. His father was known as a very enlightened and paternal employer. His factories were great places to work. And he had kind of invented the typewriter, he invented the company, the typewriter factory for that. I'll show you in a minute. I have an image coming up of the typewriter factory. I can quickly just show you what that looks like and what it looks like today. That's the first typewriter factory right there on the left, and on the right is the way it looks today. I saw it, I guess, back in 2007 or so. Just to go back to him for a second. Adriano had gone to school just like his father, at the Polytechnic of Turin. And he came to the firm in 1924, and he started at a sort of workers level there because his father thought it was very important that the managers be conversant with manual labor and be, know what it means. But then he sent him immediately to the United States to study modern management techniques. So Adriano was very, very heavily influenced by that trip to America. And he came back full of ideas about management and about changing the technology at Olivetti. You can see here the institution of the assembly line that he fostered. But he was full of ideas to expand the firm. He set up a planning office. He set up he made it a big firm. Let's put it that way. It started as a family company before it ended up being a global conglomerate with branches in Belgium and Europe and South America, as a matter of fact. Now, Adriano was also bitten by the modernism bug very early on. When he went to the States, he saw Frederick Winslow Taylor's modern management techniques, time motion studies, that kind of thing. Henry Ford, he was smitten with that as well. But he brought in the art piece into this. And that's, I think, what is so great about this man. He was a very early advocate and activist in SIAM, the International Congresses of Architecture, Modern Architecture, started by Corbusier and Siegfried Giedion and others of that time. And their view of modernism was focused on architecture at that time, but it was all embracing. Architecture was seen as crucial, of course, to urban planning, but also to social planning. Planning was the big buzzword in that period, of course. The whole idea of the plan. You can be rational, have a rational plan, and make everything work beautifully. And he saw this as the overriding concept, the idea of modernity. Humane goals were very important, and beauty was foremost. Aesthetics was very much part of this ideal that he had. And he there would mix with modern architects, many from Italy at that time. He actually brought Corbusier into Ivrea to examine Ivrea and see what could be done to make that a modern place, I would say place of innovation. He first started out wanting to, he believed in the regional plan. That was a very common way at that time to try to impose rational order. And this happened in the United States, it happened in Europe, all over Europe as well. So he came back with a great deal of ambition to look at the whole Ivrea setting and undertake a whole plan for that. And he did develop a plan with the help of some city planners. That was the master plan for the Valley of the Aosta. But Mussolini didn't counter. Mussolini was not very happy with the anti-fascist Olivetti's, and he penciled no on this plan. And right away, Adriano knew he had to give up on this, but he was a realist. So he decided to do something else. He was going to pull in his ambitions and then start with looking at a town plan for Ivrea and in the close-in area. He did this in 1941. And essentially, he was creating, the way I see it, he was creating Ivrea as an experimental laboratory for all of this, for his whole idea of community. And that's what he wanted to do with Ivrea, make that into one of these communities that could be an example for others. Now, as we talk about Ivrea, it's important, this would happen way after I visited. I was there back in 2019, as a matter of fact. But it had just been named as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I can't think of anything worse if you want to be a place of invention to be called a World Heritage Site. That means, I guess, maybe the game over or something. I don't really know what that, but it was wonderful to see this. And this was chosen as the industrial city of the 20th century. That's pretty wonderful. It'd be nice to be the 21st century, but. And these are the kind of buildings that UNESCO was celebrating. You can see the modern touch here, the architects that he brought in, that Adriano brought into the town as well. Among the architects he worked with were Luigi Figini and Giancarlo, I forget, it might be, it's Paolini anyway. And if you go to Ivrea now, these are very prominent buildings, though they're no longer Olivetti. But they were these glass and concrete structures, totally modernized the original brick buildings that were there. And there's a picture of it from the time they were built, and there, as they are when I visited in the 2007 or so, 2008, as a matter of fact. He thought a lot about the workers at his plants. This is a wonderful scene of a worker gathering in Olivetti. And he was looked up to by the workers because he took care of them, he cared about them all. It was a great place to work. I should tell you, by the way, this first part of the talk is going to be about Ivrea as a place of invention. And then after the break, I'm going to move to Programma 101 as something that emerged from this site. So you'll believe me, you'll get to Programma 101. And as was mentioned, he built things like nurseries like this. This was way ahead of his time on these kinds of things. I want to just give you a sense of what the architecture looks like in that town now. Now, if you want to see these, Ivrea now has an open air museum. You can go through the town and see labels on all these buildings now, and here's a guide to it as well. And I was guided through it by one of the people responsible, whose name was Patrizia Bonifacio. And we toured the town together. So if you get up there, I completely recommend this tour. Again, you can see some of the modernist buildings there. This is just an impression I want to give you at this point. All the structures that the council had mentioned, they have gyms, they have sports areas, they had recreation areas for the workers of all kinds, the nursery, the schools, they built schools, and he built, here's a study center that was done by Eduardo Vittoria. And this was a study center that was used by the factories for their R&D work as well. It's a beautiful building. And this is actually from '68, but it's the extension of the company housing that he built. Again, this is what made it such a wonderful place for workers to come to. They call this Mole City. I guess you can see why it's called Mole City. But this was done under his son, Roberto Olivetti. But if you go there today, you get to see this. The other part of his plan is that he picked up the Garden City idea from a very important pioneer of this notion, Ebenezer Howard, a British guy, who believed in small towns and green small towns. And this was partly what Olivetti was standing for, because he wanted to give the workers a healthy environment to live in, comfortable place to live. Fresh air, not like the industrial towns that you would see in the big cities in Italy or in any place in the world. So it was a very green town in many ways. But the only thing different from the Garden City concept was that the Garden City really didn't have, it focused on sort of artisanal kinds of industries, small industries. That was part of the brand at that time. But Olivetti, of course, was different. And that's how I came across Olivetti in the first place, because I called it then a techno city. And there were many like this at the time. What's a techno city? These are cities that had the Garden City concept, but there's a contradiction in it, because at the center, all of them had some huge industry in the middle of it. And how that tension worked out was a fascinating thing to me. And same thing with Olivetti. This, as I said, had become an international conglomerate. It was producing at one time almost as many computers as IBM. It's a big place, and yet it does have a small town feel. That was very interesting for me. So that's another part of this. And there was also an ideology of putting the rural together with the urban, the country and industry. That was one of the cardinal principles of this notion of a techno city that I think what Olivetti really had. What's really interesting is how many captains in the industry do you know that would put in scholarly journals for his workers and the public? And he resuscitated the journal on the right called Urbanista Istica, and that was for city planning. And I don't know if that journal's still going, it may well be, but also an art journal as well. It was just fascinating to go to the archives and see these journals just lined up there. It's just so atypical of these kinds of places, to see the real seriousness of intent behind these. He really wanted to put together the arts with technology, with social structures. I'm not going way over on this point. I want to say a little bit more then after he's done this to Ivrea, he wanted to take this idea of the concrete community to all of Italy. He thought this was the solution to all of Italy's problems after the war. This meant building, in his mind, cities that were essentially independent, but they were also connected to one another. They were independent governments, but they were connected to one another. They were of limited size. They were both in terms of their geographical extent, but also in populations. You know, he was thinking of 8,000 to 10,000 people for these cities. The idea of the concrete community is, it's a little bit hard to explain, but it really showed the tension that he saw between the utopian urge and the idea of bringing the utopias down to reality. These were, I translate this as material community or a concrete community, that he was not happy with high-flown ideas that didn't go anywhere, or else they were dangerous ideas. He was thinking of sort of the, the Hegelian idea for the Nazis had come up with. He wanted to get away from those ideas. He wanted down-to-earth notions for a community. They were, above all, democratic places. Now, it's interesting, they're democratic, but the leaders in these communities tended to be scientists, as he envisioned them, artists as well, intellectuals had a leading role in these communities. Now, he actually, taking them farther, they didn't go all that far, but he did come up with something that a few were created called, they were really rural communities, or a combination of rural and urban. And they existed for a while, but they died out in the 50s. But they were interesting because they actually made concrete the whole idea of the town, the industry, and the country. So they were really rural places with an urban touch to them, small city touch to them as well. What was crucial to these, this image, is they had to be human scale. And he felt the problem with Italy was that the agglomerations were either too big or they were too small. And he wanted to, what we say today, right-size them. And he often used this Vitruvian man as Leonardo's Vitruvian man as his image for this. And he had very particular ideas how that human scale would be created. Let me just finish this up. We are coming to a break shortly. Again, it's hard for me to explain right size, but what I want to do just before we go to the next part of this, which is coming up, that's not too bad. Technology was crucial to all of this. Obviously, because Ivrea is a technology town, and everybody represents that. But also he saw technology as binding together. It's this community spirit he's talking about. So technologies of communication and transportation were very important to bind the community within a place like Ivrea, let's say. And he does think of Ivrea as one of these communities, but also connecting the various pods, or whatever you want to call these, throughout Italy. And transportation, for example, the railroads are very important, but also the airplane. He talked about that. He was sort of futuristic in that, how that would happen at that time. So it's very important to understand what the proper role of technology is. And the technology, again, had to be democratic, had to relate to the people as well. It had to be humane, ethical technology, to, of course, effective technology. And this is where this is where I'm going to make the connection now in the second half of this talk to Programma 101. So if we want, we can take a break here. And I wasn't too bad, was I, Brianna?
Oh, it has been such an inspiring talk so far, Arthur. Thank you, because I mean, I don't know how many of you knew about Ivrea as, you know, a model tech city, and all the visions Adriano Olivetti had, not only for his company, but also for, you know, the well-being of his workers, and for, you know, this idea of technology with a human face. So please, if you have any questions, raise your hand or write in the chat, jump in. You know, you're really welcome to interact with the speaker. So we have a first question by Stephanie. What was unique about Ivrea that it was such fertile ground for innovation? Why there? Thank you for this question, Stephanie.
Thank you. That's a great question, because those are always the questions that I pose when I see a hotspot, wherever it is in the world. Why there? Why at that time? I mean, it's hard not to say just the happenstance that this man was there, and that he just had everything to do with this spot. That was the family town, Ivrea. His father had the same kinds of feelings, though he didn't have the grand plans that his son had. But it's hard, you know, one of the keys to founding these hotspots is you need leaders, charismatic leaders. That is a very important part of that. And you can see this, you know, in many of these hotspots in the Frederick Terman and Silicon Valley. This is a kind of thing you'd see. If you're looking at a place, it's always good to look for somebody who has the right kind of touch. And also you need leaders who have the same kind of gentle touch. Maybe that's not the right word to use for Adriano, but I think he did. He really valued people. He valued his workers, and he valued the interrelationships between people and their technology. So he had a whole idea about a technology that was human-sized and that would enhance people and not oppress them. And I just think Ivrea has everything. I can't think of any other reason why this would have started at Ivrea except for the two Olivettis. It looks like a simple answer, but I think in this case it is. Other times, other places, it's different kinds of combinations and things.
Thank you, Arthur. And if I could just add one bit, perhaps that also the closeness to Torino, Turin, the city where the Politecnico of Torino is, where it was founded, one of the big two, Politecnico in Italy, one in Milan and the other in Torino. So Torino is just 50 kilometers, it's less than 45 minutes by car from Ivrea, yeah. And I think this also perhaps played a role.
That's very important, Ariane. I should have said that, because so many of these places depend on knowledge centers. You need the skills and you need the knowledge at the in the middle of these things. It's not quite in the middle, but it's really kind of triangulated between Milan and Turin, as a matter of fact. So that's perfectly right. Just think of all the high-tech areas today around Oxford and around Stanford University, and in Austin, Texas, with their knowledge centers in these places. They don't have to be universities, but they can be research organizations, for example. So that's a very good point.
Thank you. Yes, and in Torino also there was the headquarters of the Fiat company. So it's where.
Right, that's coming up. Yes, yes.
We have another question from Dr. Stefano Gulmanelli, who is the president of the Dante Society. Here is his question. Apart from his father and his trip to the US, which was the source of inspiration for this humanistic understanding of capitalism?
I think that had very much to do with his the sort of leavening effect of art in Siam that I mentioned to you. He really fell in with these modernists who had these ideas of social change and so on. I think that was something that made him different from others who found such communities, who are not communities, but who are in the center of these hotspots. Very few of them have this broad artistic sense. And as soon as you start getting into architecture and city planning, you're of course dealing with people, with societies, and these can't be ignored. You see, I think that was a big humanizing force to him. And I think his father was a huge part of that, by the way. And don't ask me where his father got it from, but he was an active person, and he also went to, by the way, the Polytechnic of Turin. He studied electrical engineering there, as a matter of fact. But I think he pounded this into his head, Adriano's head, that it's important to have this sort of humane approach to it. And there was a lot of talk at that time about the damage wrought by the Industrial Revolution, downstream from the Industrial Revolution. People were very concerned in the 1930s about the oppression of the machines, especially in terms of the assembly lines, for example. Automation was considered a grave threat to workers in that period. Those who criticized it anyway thought it was a grave threat to it. So there was a lot of concern. I've written a lot about this, about the relationship between humans and machines, and in the Depression, especially, they saw this as a problem of unbridled technology, and a number of people felt that technology had to be reined in. Now, not many of them actually tried to do this in this very constructive way that Adriano did it.
We have another question from Guido. Interesting regarding this planning idea. I wonder if these ideas were shared with the Japanese, and then also the question is within brackets, who came first? Japan has had tech cities for decades now. Panasonic, the Japanese Mint. Do you know where Olivetti gained this idea?
I think, well, let's start with the. I don't know about any travels to Japan, but that was later. Japan started coming up with these tech cities after this period, and he was already thinking about this in the 30s, early 30s even. I do think the Garden City was a very important idea at that time, but as I said, the Garden City didn't allow for these large industries then. I never saw anything about Japan with him, but I may be wrong about that. In terms of the United States, he was really ahead of his time there too. This was not something he would have seen in his travels in the United States. Now, Silicon Valley starts going in the late 40s and early 50s. There are places in America that are the model for this are these what do you call them? These company towns, these very led by paternalist entrepreneurs, the industrialists. And there are a number of those in the United States. You could have easily seen them in the United States at various places in that period, in the 30s. They were considered humane places, but they were nothing like Adriano's, because mostly they still, under the guise of being paternal, they would still exploit workers, company stores, this kind of thing. And there were often heavy police presences in these towns too. So he could have gotten the idea from the United States. I haven't read anything about that. Yes, go ahead.
If I could step in, there is a second part of a question that I've just read again from Guido. Continuing from my previous question, was there an underlying relationship with Germany, Italy, and Japan? I don't know whether he refers also to to World War II or to the Triple Alliance, and so I don't know whether there was already something there before the war even.
Yeah. I don't think, you could, yes, I've actually written about those kinds of towns in Germany, as a matter of fact, under Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
the Hermann Goering Werke, for example, is there. A place called Salzgitter was meant to be an ideal town, though it was using Jewish slave labor and things like that. It's kind of odd, but I wrote about the contradictions in places like that. Japan, I just, again, I don't know if there was any relationship with the Axis. I guess that's what the thought is about that. So I can't say, but they did exist. These kinds of places existed throughout the 20th century, these techno cities, as I called them before. I didn't get into Japan at all, so I can't tell you that.
We have another question from Professor Francesco Zappalà. Professor Molella, you masterfully show us the second Italian Renaissance after World War II, of which Adriano Olivetti is a faithful representative that allowed to say that the first PC of the history was an Italian creation. Why did that impulse, that genius, and that Italian venture come to an end, not only from Olivetti company, but also from the wonderful Ivrea and in general from the Italian technology industry? If the first PC was Italian, why today there is no silicon Ivrea?
That's such a great thing. You're going to hear about that in the second half of this.
Okay, so we
clearly,
Olivetti
was key to the so-called economic miracle, right, for Italy after the war. Olivetti was a big company and made a big difference in Italy. But I want to talk a little bit about what happened. I don't really call this a PC. I think a desktop computer is about right, because a PC is a little bit farther down the line, and they never claimed that. But it was very interesting when I'm going to be talking about one of the engineers of this, I'm going to call it P101, Programma 101. And he ends it by saying, it was such a thrill to know Italy invented this. There was real national pride in this. And of course, I'm very proud of it. I think it's wonderful they did this. I'm going to be talking about this, and I'd love to hear your views of it.
We are at the end of our Q&A for this first part of the Q&A. And so you're welcome to share again your presentation and lead us into the second part of your talk.
Well, thank you for these marvelous questions. They're giving me a lot to think about. This is a great way to break it up. So we'll go to the next part of this talk. Okay, enter Programma 101. Now, what I want to do now is let's go to the fair. Okay, we're going to go to the fair right now. Here's the New York World's Fair of 1964 and 1965. This is a great, extravagant fair. Some people say this is the last great real World's Fair done in America. After that, there were small deals, and World's Fair changed after this. This is a huge fair. Now, the star of this fair was IBM. This is the IBM Pavilion. And this is the second time they had this pavilion. They had this before in 1958 in Brussels. They call this the egg. I'm not sure the pavilion looks like this, because the egg is bears the it simulates the IBM typing ball. If you got close, you'll see the typing ball on that. And the IBM Selectric. The IBM Selectric came out in 1961, so this is very soon. This is very near the time of this fair in 1964 and 65. Now, I want to give you a sense of the immensity of this thing. It's a huge thing, and you can just see this. That grove you see below it had many sort of interactives in it, but people would line up as here, and they would get on this grandstand with 500 people at a time, and they would be lifted up into this egg on top. And when they got in there, they would see a movie by Charles and Ray Eames called The Information Machine. Then they would be taken down hydraulically again into the garden below, and there would be interactives. Now, IBM was very concerted at that time that their mainframes were scaring people. IBM was, of course, the symbol of mainframes then. It's the biggest computer company in the world. And they knew people were worried about these kinds of things. And of course, they found them strange. The mainframe, you have to realize it's still pretty new by this time. It's still, from the early 50s, it's still fairly new. It began to scare people a little bit. And so they set up interactive stations down there, and they had people interact with them to try to make friends with this machine. Very strange idea. But they knew there were critics who said, oh, this is, machines are pressing us. It's like an Orwellian machine. They're taking over our humanity, and they're going to actually take away our autonomy as people. So IBM was there for good reasons. What everybody did at fairs like this, they went there to try to win customers. But the other thing about IBM then, it had just won a huge contract along with MIT and the US government to set up the SAGE computer defense system up in Alaska. This is a system that was to identify and stop Soviet ICBMs coming over the pole. They got a huge contract, and this really made the firm at that time. And it got them identified as the center of the military industrial complex in America in that period. It was a Cold War company, for sure. Well, this kind of thing would be anathema, of course, to somebody like Adriano, who's dead, by the way. Adriano died in 1960. There's going to be more about that coming up. Now, initially, if you look at history books, you look at the internet, everything says that the Programma 101 was shown there at the same World's Fair. And I actually got attracted to this at first because, oh, that's really neat. We got IBM, and Olivetti wasn't a small business at all, but had a small machine at that fair. And it was the mainframe, as a matter of fact. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. It wasn't at that fair. And I'm going to tell you why. There was no Italian pavilion at the World's Fair. There's a Vatican pavilion, no Italian national pavilion. The reason is that Robert Moses had flouted the rules of the the International Bureau for Expositions, which regulates World's Fairs, and had done all kinds of things to ignore what the rules about this. So many major countries did not take part in that fair. And Italy was one of those countries. Many European countries did not participate in that fair. So there was no place for the Programma 101 there. Instead, it was showing at another place not too far from there that was for the Business Equipment Manufacturers Association. It's the last time I'm going to say that. I'm going to call it BEMA from now on. But they were afraid that this was too futuristic to be at the World's Fair. I mean, to have Programma 101 starring that BEMA convention. Before this, Olivetti was famous for its mechanical calculators and typewriters, of course, but mechanical calculators primarily at that point. So when they sent P101 there, they put it in a little booth, a little back, sort of, in back of this booth, as a matter of fact, because they were hedging their bets. They didn't want people to be turned off by this futuristic machine that nobody recognized. Well, something very strange happened. It caused a sensation. And this is, I wanted to show you a sense of the people crowding around this little computer. So the reason I brought up the fact that it's a BEMA and not at the World's Fair, because this says something else about this machine. It provoked myths. It prompted myths of all kinds about it. This little machine that came out, seemed to come out of nowhere, was there, but it was a futuristic machine. And the World's Fair was about the future. Actually, the biggest exhibit was Futurama by GM. It was all about looking into the future for the New York World's Fair. So everybody just assumed that it had to be at that fair. And I asked one of the engineers about this. He says, well, you got to forgive people for making that mistake. I think it says something good about P101. So just I want to correct the historical record on that, because books still come out saying it was at the World's Fair. And I wish it were, but it's not. It wasn't. I would have had a better book if that was there. But I saved it still. Well, I'll tell you now the backstory of P101. As I said, Adriano had died suddenly in 1960. And his son, Roberto Olivetti, took over the firm at that point. And he's the one that started this idea of having an electrical calculator that was partially automated as well. So he's the one that started up a team. Now, I spent a lot of time when I was in Milan interviewing this man, Giovanni De Sandre. He was one of the pioneering team. And we know that because of Adriano and what he created, this hotspot in Ivrea, that engineers were attracted from around Italy. They all wanted to work there. It was a great place to work if you're an engineer. If you'll indulge me for a second, I want to give you some quotation I have from his micro-history of the P101. Let me tell you a little bit about De Sandre first, by the way. He was one of the pioneers of this. And my next part of my research is going to be more on the engineers of P101. He welcomed me and my wife very generously into his family. He's known, by the way, as Johnny to friends and family. He's a tall, lively man, now in his late 80s. Hard of hearing, quite hard of hearing, but otherwise in fine health. He had an incredibly curious mind. And he was passionate about what he did with P101, Programma 101. That's actually become his life's work, to defend its history, its role in history. I also should mention about Johnny is he's a crazy bat out of the hell driver. And I can tell you that from white knuckled rides between the Milan suburb where he lives up to Ivrea and back. It was really scary to drive with him. And if you told him to slow down, he couldn't hear you because he just couldn't hear you. But that was a life experience for me. But that tells you something about his spirit. Let me tell you what he said about working for Olivetti. Said, I got my master's degree at the Polytechnic of Milan in December 1959. So he went to Milan, not to, family's from Milan. After 5 years of full immersion, it was not easy. But life was easy for those who were seeking a job with a good science degree. He said, I received several job offers from large companies like Pirelli, Siemens, Eni, Olivetti, and others. The reasons for my choice are clear and simple. Attraction to the emerging field of computers, the siren of Olivetti's electronics lab, the comparison between the style of human relations in Olivetti and in other large companies that contacted me. That was very telling, I think, why he thought that was important. They also attracted designers. Makes sense. I mean, that was a very important value to Adriano. And it was famous for a stable of great designers. With Mario Bellini, you see on the left, he was the guy who stylized P101, as a matter of fact. And I love this one, Ettore Sozzas. They call him the godfather of Italian cool. Now, that is a great title to have. Now, actually, Olivetti was very big in the computer business, mainframe computer business, before, well, simultaneously with P101. And here we see Adriano with Mario Chu, who is a brilliant head of their research labs at Olivetti. And there's the mainframe. It's now, you can see that console anyway at the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Milan as well. So keep that in mind, that you have a mainframe business going at Olivetti. Now, Roberto Olivetti brought in the head of research, Pier Giorgio Perotto, to set up the small tiger team, as it were, for the P101. Here's the core team. In the front row, you have Pier Giorgio Perotto. We got Gianni DeSandre. In the back is Gastone Garziera, and then Giancarlo Topi. The only ones I met were DeSandre and Gastone Garziera. Perotto had unfortunately died about 2 years before, and I wish I could have met him. He was a brilliant man, and he's written a lot about P101, his experiences with P101. Just one second, I had some more quotes here. Let me see if this is the time to introduce these quotes. Well, this was the tiger team, and what they did was they set this up in a small skunk works in a suburb of Milan. And by the time I got to Milan, the building was still there and the area was still there, but it had been cleared, the lab itself. I would have loved to have seen the lab. What you see on the left, on our left, is the prototype of P101 in that lab. Can you see that clearly enough there? Is it? I can't make that any bigger, but there it is. These engineers were a joy to interview and to work with, I have to tell you. Now, interestingly, the P101 is a result of contingency of all kinds, and had several near-death experiences before it made it out into the world. And one of the near-death experiences was that GE bought the electronics lab of Olivetti in 1964. And we're going to hear more about this in a bit, but Olivetti was basically forced to sell it. And Perotto was a very determined man, and he was not about to let his pet project go, which had started a couple of years before, go to GE. So he had a ruse for it. He claimed, he convinced them that the P101 was only an enhanced mechanical computer. It was not a real electronic computer. And lo and behold, they got to keep this project because they were sure if it went to GE, that GE would not want to do this, to sponsor something like this. That was that was one of their near-death experiences for this as well. I think I have a quote here. Okay, the whole task here was to miniaturize this darn thing, the computer, from a room size to that size that you see here. And that was an amazing feat. I have no idea how they did this, but I just want to give you a sense of urgency on this by letting you hear, again, from on the bottom right, Giovanni DeSandre. He said, "It seemed to us almost impossible that in the rest of the world, no one else was thinking the same thing and could beat us to the finish line. We then began a race against the clock, committing ourselves to the utmost. The day was ending almost at midnight, pausing for dinner at Brusen, a friendly country inn, and sometimes too abundant libations of Barbara did not contribute to the cause of P101. It was not uncommon that Saturday and Sunday were dedicated to the cause with probable disappointment of respective wife and girlfriend." Well, they did it. And there were, I just mentioned a couple of stumbling blocks. I won't go into any details on this, but one of the real problems is how do you shrink the memory for this? And this is the so-called, this is what they opted for on the left, the MSL prototype using a nickel alloy wire, and that's a production sample on the right for that. And that they were able to conquer that, and partly by going to the United States again, and they borrowed some of the technology for that, to do that. The other stumbling block was how do you miniaturize a printer? And they were able to do that. And then their magnetic card, the cartolina, you see on the right, that was also miniaturized. Well, they did it. And by, let's see, what was it? I think it was October 1964. This is the final prototype. They began calling it the Perotina at this point in honor of Perotto. And people still call it that, the Perotina. Well, they were now at the startup phase. And they started marketing it, and the inimitable Olivetti way, or the Italian way, if you will, these beautiful kinds of graphics that they produced are just stunning. And they decided at that time they would send it to the British, to the BIMA fair. Now, one of the reasons they did this was actually because of IBM being there, not because they were going to challenge IBM and the market and that kind of thing, they thought, but because they wanted to raise the flag for an alternative kind of technology, human scale technology. I think that was a modest, but I think it had a realistic goal for them. As I said, they weren't trying to overcome, they simply wanted to show you that there was another way to go on this. Now, it's about time I introduced this to you. So I've got about a minute's worth of video that I took up at the Ivrea Museum, at the Olivetti Museum in Ivrea. It's kind of a back of the store kind of museum, but they have several P101s. So I'll just play this little video for you if you listen. So this is
that's complex operation. That's complex things.
The question about, you can translate this. The question they have about the Perotina, was it a true computer or was it a calculator?
Ah sì, la domanda che hanno se era un vero computer o un calcolatore.
That's the question. Okay? And this is a true computer.
For
me, yes, because at that time the computer was a machine that did the calculation.
Yeah.
See, at the time,
like the computer at that time.
At the, so for instance, computer, because computers at that time were machines that did calculations.
Yeah, there you go. Had a program, they put a program in it.
Yeah.
After you had everything inside the computer, for processing, not only the calculation, the storage, selection of the data, pictures, everything. But at that time was the formation of the calculation.
So this uses integrated. Well, that's, by the way, a friend of ours, Laura Bamirali. So I thank her for being the translator for me on this. Though they did pretty good in Italian. But you had the fellow speaking was Gastone Garcia, and on the left here you see Gianni De Sandre there as well. And it was an amazing demonstration because they'd have games on it, they can play on it. You wouldn't do that with a calculating machine we normally have at that time. So it was doing all kinds of tricks. So that's what made this really, really special to see. Now let's bring this back a little bit now to the connection again with the ideology that was championed by Adriano. And Perotto has written a lot about this. I'm having a little trouble reading this because can you I'm not going to read it to you, but can you all read this? I can't. I have the problem with seeing beyond the people's.
Arthur, I can read it for you if you
want. The thumbnails. Well, read it. You don't have to read the whole thing, but I think the part that I give there, but I can't see because of the thumbnails in front of it.
Okay, so from the computer, the character of a large Moloch located in a computer center assisted by technicians in white coats, inaccessible and far from the users. You wanted me to read just this last part?
Well, everybody else, I don't think you have to read it all, but other people can look at that. But
Oh,
that's,
I can read the whole thing. So the introduction of transistors gave rise to the second generation of electronic calculators and made the machines more reliable and in practice commercially usable with a minimum of practicality. But it did not take away from the computer the character of a large Moloch, located in a computer center assisted by technicians in white coats, inaccessible and far from the users.
by the way, those of you who have seen Fritz Lang's Metropolis, the monster there was called a Moloch, as a matter of fact. So they're very aware of this when they say these things, by the way. He goes on in this vein. Can we do this again? This is Perotto again. Can you read that for us again? Because I don't think anybody else can see it either because
Yes.
of the way I have
In
this.
essence, the panorama of the world of calculation and office work was still that of a regime of enslavement and slavery to the unnatural laws dictated by the machines. Man, freed from physical fatigue, had not yet found a way to free himself from the routine of oppressive and gray immaterial works, which were not very pleasant.
At the same time, I should tell you that Garciera and DeSandre also echoed him when they said, I'm going to read this. This is Garciera. At the time, the computer was something which seemed guarded by priests. And Johnny DeSandre said, going into a computer room was just like entering a hospital. Everyone would be wearing white coats. This is just what you would expect to hear from Adriano. And they were very hard-nosed people, by the way. These are really hardworking engineers. And I wouldn't say, I wouldn't call Johnny DeSandre a poet or anything like that. But I think this really demonstrates how important it was to have that, that kind of thinking going on in Ivrea about machines, even though they made these, these big computers themselves. But the people who worked on this project felt very strongly about this, the human scale of all of these things. And what they would do, you would want these computers to be, in your home, you would want them in your schools, you want them in places where you can never hit fit a mainframe. So this is very much of the rhetoric and the beliefs of Adriano Olivetti. So clearly, when they're working on this, they're just thinking, how do we make things smaller? What do we do? And I mean, there are all kinds of stories about DeSandre and how he's working day and night and he barely pays attention to his family. It's kind of interesting as well. So interestingly, this prefigured I don't know if any of you ever saw the TV ad at the 1984 Super Bowl for the homage to for the Macintosh. And it's in 1984 is Orwell, and I mean you got to see that. I don't want to play that for you, but there's your Moloch in the middle there. The guy shouting at these workers, who workers look like these are these clones from Brave New World at that time, this kind of thing. And then finally, the lady comes down with a sledgehammer in her hand, and she throws it at this huge TV screen and shatters it, and then the Macintosh comes forth. So they prefigured this. I think there's the same rhetoric you see in Steve Jobs, or actually the guy behind this was Steve, the other Steve in that thing, not Jobs, but doesn't matter. One of the people on the Macintosh. So as a result of the surprise sales of this and the interest, Programma 101 just then goes into production. And it's sold a tremendous amount to begin with. I mean, something like 40,000 units sold in 2 or 3 years. It went very fast, as a matter of fact. So here's a production site here as well. And it was also picked up by NASA as well. And if you went to the BEMA stand at PIA 101, they had a guy that would calculate satellite orbits using the Paratina. People I've talked to said it was a marvelous machine. People have used it in school. People, younger than me use this thing in school. And it was a very versatile machine. It's an amazing thing. It's how it not only looks beautiful, it really does work. So it had all this fame, and it just really took off in the world. And it's got in design museums, but also it was really used. Now, despite this great start I mean, I point out too, by the way, the newspapers picked this up. I did a lot of work at this is a typical report about this. We may see a computer in every office, even before there are 2 cars in every garage. I don't know about that, but this was very typical of the kind of press that it got. But the reign of P101 didn't last all that long. Let me tell you about the reign of P101 for a second. Now, let me go back to what happened to Olivetti. This bears on that question that people asked before, what happened to the Programma 101? In 1962-63, Europe had a very bad recession. And this struck Olivetti. At the same time, Olivetti had made Adriano himself had made a very bad decision to purchase the Underwood typewriter company in Connecticut, in America. And he bought a white elephant. It was really bad. And it was just a big loser for them. So the combination of those two things really sunk the company in that period. So the company then was basically subject to what they called intervention. The major industrialists in Turin came in and on a rotating basis took over the management of the company. Fiat was very big in this. And the first thing they did was to throw out Roberto Olivetti. And the stock price of Olivetti went way down drastically, just tanked. And so the company was in really desperate circumstances. And they forced then the company to sell its electronics division to GE that Perotto had rescued the P101 from. They forced it to sell. And so this was not quite a death blow to P101, but it was very important to it. The irony about this is the company managers, Fiat and others, didn't see what the value of just sort of switching from the mainframe to where they had clear success with the P101. Instead, they said, let's go back to the mechanical calculator. And they just basically stopped supporting the P101 and then wanted to go back to what they knew best. This is a story about companies you hear all the time. I mean, Kodak is the place that discovered the digital camera, but they wouldn't accept it because they thought they were a chemical company and destroyed the firm because they would not go with a digital camera. They would have just cleaned up if they had done that, but they were on the ground floor. So this is what you have to watch out for. People always want to stick with something that's familiar to them and not something different, even though they had such demonstration of the power of this. There's another part of this that's important. They didn't like Adriano because Adriano had traveled to Russia a lot and he had this communitarian idea, which they conflated with communism. And these are very right-wing guys, and I say guys, that ran these firms at that time. And they wanted to have really nothing to do with him or his products. So he was dead by this time. But they were very suspicious. And well, remember I talked about the mythology around this machine. There's a dark myth that comes out about the machine, that comes out. When I was leaving that demonstration I showed you, one of the fellows, not our two guys, the other fellow sitting in the background, pulled me aside and he started whispering to me, what? Well, there's a whole rumor about a Cold War conspiracy against both Adriano, the company, and P101. So I listened to this. They insist that when Adriano supposedly died on a train of a heart attack, and secondly, Mario Chu, who you saw early on, he died in a traffic accident the next year, and those were considered, they were thought to be assassinations. Perpetrated not only by the captains of industry, but by the CIA and the Secret Service of the United States in there, because the United States were afraid that on the many trips that he had taken to Russia or the Soviet Union at that time, he would take numerical control technology to the Soviet Union. And that was a Cold War no-no for them. So they have this vast conspiracy that was happening. I didn't want to pursue this at the time. I may at some point. There was actually somebody who wrote a whole book on this whole thing. I don't know how I feel about it. because in fact, this conspiracy was popularized in Italy a couple of years ago in this TV show called the Power of a Dream, Forza di un Sogno. And it stars, by the way, of Luca Zingaretti. I don't know how many of you saw him as the commissario in Sicily, that TV series. He's great in that. Anyway, this whole thing does say that he was assassinated at that time. So I have a friend, she's worked on this. She's got a book on it, Myrtle Seacrest. You can look at her book where she says this was clearly a plot to get rid of the Olivetti company and the main actors. It's a pretty strong and sad story. Now, neither one of these guys, Johnny and Gastone, they didn't want to talk with this. Basically, it's overdetermined. You had lots of reasons for wanting to do this, to get to explain the disappearance of Programma 101. But basically, by the late 70s, Programma 101 was just kind of disappeared as from the consciousness of people. They were around, but it was gone because of this. And to their credit, these two fellows go around to schools and other places and talking about the history of this and doing demonstrations. They're just wonderful guys. I just tell you, they're wonderful people. And I can't help but think that, well, here, by the way, this is a story I found in the New York Times, September 2019, titled "Utopia Abandoned." The Italian town of Ivrea was once a model for workers' rights and progressive design. Now it's both a cautionary tale and evidence of a grand experiment in making labor humane. That is a pretty sad ending for things. But I can't help but think that if Olivetti had lived only 5 more years, he would have seen this Programma 101. He would have recognized the animal for what it was. It was a fulfillment of his own dream of what technology should be. And do you want me to read the English on this about what he says? I love this thing. I just found this serendipity. Should I read that?
If you can.
Oh yeah, I'll read the bottom ones in English. The term utopia is the most convenient way. This is Adriano speaking. The term utopia is the most convenient way to dismiss what you don't have, the will, the ability, or dream. I can't actually read what's under there. Actually, can somebody read that?
I can do it for you.
Please, yes.
The term utopia is the most convenient way to dismiss what you don't have the will, the ability, or the courage to do. A dream seems like a dream until you start somewhere. Only then does it become a purpose, that is, something infinitely greater. Thank you.
That says it all. I mean, it also shows you he's not a castle in the air guy. He's not a dreamy utopian. He wanted to get things done, and this man did. And I have to say it, this is my tribute to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for this absolutely interesting and awe-inspiring tale. It's more of a tale even than just a simple story about this wonderful Italian entrepreneur. I think there are already some questions. Let me see in the chat here. Yes. As Professor Molella mentioned, Luca Zingaretti is the Italian actor for playing Salva Montebasso. No, it's more a comment on your on the movie you were talking about on Olivetti.
Sonia, yeah.
Yes.
Power Dream.
So Christine, she's asking, can you repeat what it was that gave GE the edge to buy Olivetti Electronics?
Well, GE, you could say it was partly a competitor to Olivetti. So that's one way of getting rid of something. I mean, everybody knew if GE took it, they would not have supported the P101. But that was a firm that was willing to take on the Olivetti Electronics. They didn't build the Ivrea anymore, anything like that. That didn't survive that. But I guess the edge was they were a huge company, and they could absorb it, and they could use some of the talent and the materials that they had there as well. I don't know the ins and outs of how GE got it, but they basically they had a deal was struck and that Olivetti was forced to sell the business, and GE was a taker on that. I'm sorry, I can't really tell you the ins and outs. I could find that out though.
Yes, and Stefano Gulmanelli is saying it looks like another Enrico Matteis thing, and that's also what I immediately
I didn't hear what you said. It looks like what?
Like an Enrico Matteis kind of story, the story about Adriano Olivetti and the fact that. And so I don't know whether you know anything about Enrico Mattei as president of ENI, and that
No, I don't.
Yes, again, there was a kind of, there are stories about, again, also another Cold War conspiracy, because he was trying to develop a national company for the petroleum oil extraction, especially in the southern part of Italy, in the Mediterranean Sea, and then he was stopped, and so it was a nationalized oil company. And they say that he was killed because his plane was
bombed or something.
We don't know whether it was bombed, but that's what they think, that the plane crashed, but it was not an accident. It was something more than an accident.
Yeah, were Americans involved in any of this?
Yeah, again, they say that the CIA was involved in that. There was also, again, another movie made on Enrico Mattei's story.
I didn't see that. This one I was able to, it was hard to get it, but I was able to get it actually in English through Laura Banderali's son. He sent me he's pirated a copy for me to see.
In the meantime, there are other questions from Francesco. What would be the price of a perfectly working Programma 101 today?
Oh, I don't. At the time it sold for about $3,200, and I don't know what that would be today. Can somebody do multiply? It would probably be 25,000, something like that today. 25 in dollars, right? Okay. Yeah, probably that. It's not cheap, but you compare that to the price of a mainframe. Okay, and that's what the competition was a mainframe, which would be an order of magnitude more than these things. So.
Yes. And Christine was saying it's just more of a comment. Wonder how it would have gone if IBM had bought them instead.
I think IBM would have killed it off. That's my feeling.
Yes.
I mean, they did go into the PC business for a while, and they of course they gave it to China afterwards. So they IBM is a classic case. So they wanted to stay with the mainframe, and they survived by doing that. They did survive. Not all places do survive by sticking with the old technologies. We still need mainframes. You couldn't have built the Sage system I don't think you could, with a PC.
Yes. And Stefan is asking, what was the relationship between Olivetti and the Italian state, if you know that answer?
Well, obviously a mixed reputation with the Italian state. He was, of course, persona non grata at the time toward Mussolini and about the successor. What name did I give for him? I forget his name, for the Badoglio. He was non grata at that time. He was a pretty prominent politician. He ended up being mayor of Ivrea in 1958. He ran the country he ran the town for a couple of years, and he did have political ambitions, but he wasn't. He was considered a communitarian guy. He was not one of their wasn't their kind of guy. He wasn't conservative, and I can't imagine that he would have been welcomed in any higher circles in Italy at that time. He was considered a danger by some people.
Yes, he meant, as Stefano said, he meant the Republic, the Italian Republic, and that's in any case.
After that, yeah. But I still think it would have been conservative, and it wouldn't have been. Well, Italy by the mid-60s, of course, was the most communist country in Europe at that time. So that also had led to suspicion. I'm talking about the other, the heads of Fiat and Pirelli. They didn't want to.
Actually, it was not the most communist country. It had a very strong communist party, although the Christian Democrats were, the majority.
Had the strongest communist party in Europe at that period.
Yes.
But
So
they
we
were,
have a question from Renato Zane. It seems that innovative machines with innovative designs require a paternalistic capitalist to push their dreams into reality. Steve Jobs, Adriano, etc.
Mhm.
Larger companies appear to have the effect of squashing creativity, especially in humanistic design. Is this something you have seen in other hotspots of innovation that you have studied?
Well, you know, it's such a, if you're looking today, it's such a value today that you'd have to be barbarian to be saying that kind of thing now. So, you know, Silicon Valley has kind of now dominated our mental landscape here. And they've got a lot of clout too against the big firms as well, even against Microsoft. So I don't know. Have I seen our company's conservative? Yes, big companies are conservative, and everybody knows that startups are the places that, you look at the pharmaceutical industry as well. They have to go to these biotech companies to get innovation. They are no longer themselves centers of innovation. At best, they are welcomers of innovation when they get it, but they don't generate it anymore. So they don't try to quash it either, because they know their life depends on it, on this innovation, which they try to co-opt and take it in. So I think in Adriano's time, he was seen as a general threat to these establishment companies. I think she's right about that.
Yeah. I think if there are other questions, because it's already 6:36. It's you know, we have been together, so we yes, or I've already gone a bit over time, but if there are no other questions, I think it's high time, you know, we leave Arthur to his evening, because it's 3 hours ahead in Washington, D.C., so it's already 9:30 for him.
My bedtime.
Pardon?
It's my bedtime.
Bedtime. Yes. Yes. Arthur, there have been a lot of thank you and a lot of congratulatory comments on the chat. Because of the after, I mean, the end of your talk, Becky is saying a wonderful presentation, so interesting, Carol, and so thank you again for for having accepted to give this talk to the Dante Society. And we hope to have you again, not perhaps in person next time after this COVID situation is under control. Thank you again for this beautiful talk, and thank you for everyone. Thank you for being part.
It was such a. Let me just say, it was such a pleasure to meet with you all, and those questions were great questions. It gave me a lot to think about. Thank you for those, and being such a receptive audience. I much appreciate that.
Yes,
I'll let you know when I get.
I like that, very receptive audience. So thank you again, and
buonasera.
see you again for our next event.
Buonasera, buonanotte.
Good evening to everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.